Hi everyone, this is going to be a demonstration on watercolors and different techniques and how to use them. We are going to be using the Grumbacher Deluxe Transparent watercolors. This is probably one of my favorite types of watercolors because while the colors are still pigmented, they still can be translucent, and they're great for depth of color. Okay, so this comes with 24 colors. This many colors is not necessary. You can definitely do the same amount of stuff with the 12 pack, but I was feeling fancy, so this is what I purchased. We've got a flat brush here. This is like a medium-sized flat brush. Okay, it's a Taklon Selectum white. It's synthetic bristles, but I do really like these. We also have here a mop brush that we're going to be working with. We're going to talk about like how to use it effectively. Use a mop brush. We do have a fan brush. We're going to talk about them briefly, but I personally feel like this is a very overrated type of brush, so we're going to talk about the few techniques that I've used for these. Got a small detailed flat brush. It's very tiny. It's a long, delicate brush. I really like these. They're especially great for small like feathering techniques. I really like those. We've got a long bristled fine liner. It's a Princeton Winslet liner. I really like these too, actually. These are beautiful for watercolor. Great spees. We're going to discuss, this is a stick. They feel similar to a hog's hair brush, however they are synthetic as well, so I do really like this as well. We're going to talk about a big brush. This is a large size. There are also smaller round brushes. I think I have a couple here. Yeah, here's a smaller round brush. The same, similar like tip, but different in size, obviously. These are probably the most common brushes that people have seen before. They usually come in like those little kits at the dollar store. More flat brushes. This is like a basic like Filbert, kind of rounded, but it's still flat. Okay. Some of these obviously were not washed very well. These are the paint brushes that my students use, so take care of your brushes. We also have a container with some water. This is dirty water, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's not the only demo I'm recording today. I tend to try to keep these if they're not too painted because they work just fine and I don't like being wasteful. I have a sheet of watercolor paper here. I believe it is a 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor sheet. I cut it to 8.5 by 11, and then I just got some paint. These boxes are going to act as a place to test out your different techniques, and it'll keep each of the areas separate, so then when you take the tape off you can actually label the different techniques and which brush you use for them. Alright, so yeah, that's it for the intro, and let's get painting. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is how to do a flat wash. A flat wash is probably one of the most useful and techniques in art. You can use it with oil paints, you can use it with gouache, you can use it with watercolor, but it's definitely something you would want to learn because it basically is doing exactly what it sounds like. You're making a wash that is flat. It has no texture movement, so it kind of creates a neutral space or body of color without those brush strokes that a lot of people try to get rid of. So let's use a blue because it'll be easier to see. One of my first things that I like to do is I like to really saturate the color with water. I tend to do this just mostly to make sure that the consistency, it's going to be fluid, it's not going to be over watered down, and that there's going to be, you know, a little bit of a surplus of that liquid color that I like. A lot of the time what happens is sometimes kids, or people in general, will take a paintbrush and they'll just kind of give it a little swoosh, and it tends to not really get the full hue of the color, so it's not. Also then when they dip back in, they take a little bit more color than they used to have because every time you wet it, you're saturating it, right? So then when you take your newly dipped brush and you put it on something that was watered down, it's going to be a lot more pigmented, and then you're going to have a differentiation in your value there. So now you can see that there's like marks there, right? So I'm going to take my brush I'm actually going to rinse it off. I'm going to dab it on my towel, and then I'm going to go over that area one more time. Yeah, so this is, it's kind of like you're taking away the excess moisture, and all that's left is the paint that you put down. So it's actually a really nice flat wash. There's not going to be any brush strokes there. You can do this on an entire page, you can do this in sections, but it really is nice if you want to have something that is flat and neutral so that other things pop a bit more. Okay, now I'm going to talk about how to do a gradient. Saturate that color one more time. Right? Okay, so I'm going to actually go up and down this way. Okay, so you're going to get a nice kind of consistent body here. Now I kind of clean what's on it. I take some of the excess moisture off, and then I kind of just let it bleed into that next area. Okay, I'm going to dab again. Less moisture. Should look something like that. Okay, it's going to dry in a little bit. I'm going to take some of that excess moisture away actually. We're now going to talk about a color gradient where you transition one color into another color, and the process is very similar, where you take your color and you place it down with a fair bit amount of water, and then you mirror that action with the other color on the other side. And then just to make sure that they blend into one another, you would make slow brush strokes up and down into the other color while still removing some of that excess moisture. And you want a little bit of water to stay on the paper, but not enough that it's a puddle. You want it to glisten. You don't want it to look like it'll fall off the page. So pretty. If you wanted it even brighter than this, I would recommend you maybe wait for it to dry and then come back and beef it up again. So let me do a quick flat brush technique here. Okay, so we've got our flat brush, right? We're going to dip one end in the blue. We're going to dip the other end in the purple. Isn't that pretty? It's kind of like a little gradient in the brush. So, now we're done with the... So this is a round brush. This is probably one of the most common paintbrushes that there are. Okay? It's common because it's very versatile. You can use it for different things. It's also probably one of the most familiar ones to people because it tends to be included with a lot of different kits. Let's go with this blue. Once again, you saturate the color, right? Because you're not going to get the same pigment that's consistent unless it's like really saturated. I love these cakes. Like anything that's like a watercolor cake, they literally will last forever if you take care of them. I've got a couple students who are actually using their parents' watercolors from when they were in school, and I think some of them were in high school, and they're still in like amazing, they're still great quality. They're still, and I prefer these to the watercolor tubes. Our gradients are there. We're going to use this little box here. Okay, so a round brush is really great because you can use it as a line drawing to make different mark makings like that. It's also got a really nice way to manipulate the brush strokes. You can get really nice organic shapes. And they also just tend to be great for drawing like regular shape. Right? Like there's a little bit more control with the round brush. There we go. We're going to let Mickey dry here actually for a second for another technique. But that's what your round brush does. Okay. So our next brush that we're going to talk about is called the stippling brush. That's this one, right? The stippling brush has pretty firm bristles. It's very coarse hair. It kind of feels like, what's a good example? You know, like those round brushes that you can use, right? And they're kind of prickly. That's kind of what it feels like, okay? So the thing is with the stippling brush, you actually don't want to use too much water, especially with watercolor. They bleed each other so much, so you're just gonna dip your stippling brush there. And it's gonna kind of just make a, right? So this technique is actually really great if you're going to be doing things like leaves on trees or bushes, or you're just trying to add texture to something. It also would be great for fields if you're doing grass or clouds even. Anything where you're breaking apart that texture, this would be a really great one. And you can actually layer your colors too. You just want to make sure that your brush is clean and then dry, because you don't want to put wet stuff on top of it. It'll make it all bleed. So I'm just stamping that off there. Good. Okay, so this is a technique that we're going to be using a mop brush for. This is a mop brush. Okay, the reason it's a mop brush is because these bristles hang on to moisture like crazy. And one of the reasons you might want to do this is because it has a lot of moisture, and it would be great to do for flat washes as well, but it's also great if you're going to be using it for large backgrounds. Okay. One other thing you might want to use it for is when you're using the wet on wet technique. That is when you take your brush that has no paint on it. This might have a little bit, but that's okay. You just make a little bit of a wash, okay? And you're gonna take a small paintbrush, something where you can make lines. This is a liner, so we're gonna take that and we're gonna draw directly on top of it. Okay, so this technique is obviously not great if you love a lot of control, but it is really great if you want a little bit of freedom and you want the water to kind of do a lot of the organic shape making for it. So I don't know if you guys can see here, but like that little zigzag I did, it actually kind of like spiders out into like these little organic spikes. I really love that effect. Okay. We're actually going to focus on this liner a little bit longer. So one of the things that I like to use it for is to bring some of the details back out. Often with watercolor, the paint can bleed, and one of the nice parts about it is that it can become very loose and ethereal. But sometimes you lose those hard edges and those defined lines or details, which make it a little bit more dynamic. So we're going to bring Mickey back by outlining him and just kind of reinforcing those edges that'll make him pop more and make him feel more like a solid object. We're going to talk about the fan brush now. A fan brush is usually a long, thin brush with bristles that kind of create a fan. I personally feel like these are very overrated and glorified brushes when you can often get similar mark making techniques with other tools and brushes that you already might have in your arsenal. However, if you do have one, these are a couple ways you can use them. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Bob Ross evergreen technique, where you use the length of the brush to create the trunk and then use a swishing motion back and forth to get the evergreen branches. Then there's a stamping motion where you can kind of simulate bushes and shrubs, and then there's a wispy technique as well for tall grasses and things like that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the Filbert. Okay, these are synthetic brushes, by the way. They're not hog's hair or sable or any other real animal hair. These are all synthetic brushes. And so you're really going to saturate your brush. We're going to be using a red for this one. And this is great because it's got a rounded edge, so you can use it for organic shapes. You can also use it as a flat brush if you don't need a flat edge. Like if something like this where things are taped off, it'll still work as a flat brush if you need like a wash or something. And you can use this as like a line work technique, or you can use it just because the tips of the bristles are curved like that. So great for mountains. I also love this brush when you're working with oils because it can make a really nice feathering texture, which I can show when we do a oil technique demo. Next we're going to talk about is a very large round brush. These brushes are a little too big for watercolor, but if you're going to be using it as a substitute for a mop brush, it's not a bad idea because they retain a lot of water. So this is great because you can use it as a chisel tip, or you can use it as a flat wash as well, right? Because it is pretty big and the consistency of water is pretty even. This is a fine liner. I actually really love these brushes. And we're gonna do wet on dry. So opposite to the wet on wet, where you would wet the entire area and put the color that you want, here you are gonna have a select space that has water, and you're going to then deposit the pigment that you want into that space. And because you've decided where you're going to target the water, it'll ensure that your color doesn't bleed anywhere else, as long as the areas surrounding it are dry. Now we're going to talk about angle brushes. I've got two sizes here. We're just going to use the smaller one, but the medium one is available in the art lab. And we're going to be also talking about the bright brush. And I use this for light sources or for small textures. Also a really great brush for foliage and other plant textures as well. We're going to do this one first. We're going to saturate the purple really quick. So you've got the edges in one color and the tip in the other color. The water ratio in this example is a little high, so I'm going to do another one. There we go. I think I just needed a little less water. We're going to dab again, but not increase the water amount. So now we're going to talk about the bright brush. This is a very small flat brush. It's got flat bristles at the tip, and this is great for either small feathering textures, small details, and also just line techniques as well. If you're trying to get a nice clean line, these are often great brushes for that. Alright, and that summarizes all the different brushes that we have available in the art lab and the techniques that you can use with them. Please feel free to do these demo sheets. I feel like these are really important exercises to practice, and it kind of creates a safe space to experiment and try out new different things and familiarize yourself with the equipment. Definitely take this and use it to be as creative as possible, and I can't wait to see what you all create. So please make sure you send me those images of your work using these techniques, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for your attention, and have fun. Happy arting!